Hey guys, this is your Chapter 2 video lecture. We will be talking about understanding fitness principles today, but I just wanted to remind you that your behavior change contract is due tonight. So make sure you guys get that submit that to Blackboard, and I'll make sure to grade. So your syllabus assignment should have been graded automatically whenever you submitted your whenever you completed the exam or the test or the quiz or whatever. The student video intro, I still have to grade, so I'll make sure I spend some time grading those and get you some feedback. And then behavior change contract is due tonight, so get that to me so I can sign it and send it back to you. Okay. The VO2 max test is due, I believe, this Sunday. Let me make sure that my dates are correct. Okay, it's next Tuesday. Okay, so you have a week to complete the VO2 max test. I'm going to discuss the VO2 max test in this video, so don't be alarmed. It's a simple equation. All you have to do is run 12 minutes, and whatever the distance you run in 12 minutes is the you just input that distance into the equation, and you can find your VO2 max. But I will discuss that in this video. Okay, so again, this is Chapter 2, Understanding Fitness Principles. What I like to do when I start this chapter is I introduce to you what's called the energy continuum. Yeah, I like continuum. You remember the illness-wellness continuum from Chapter 1. With this continuum, this right here shows our capacity to function, our capacity to do work. Okay, we have two endpoints starting with the left side. You can see here it says 0% intensity. At the same time, it also says 1 MET, which is a metabolic equivalent. I'll explain that in a second. And it also says RHR. RHR stands for resting heart rate. Okay. So at 0% intensity, it means that you're at your deepest rest, at the most rested state. Okay. Now your resting heart rate is not 0 at this point, otherwise you'd be dead. Okay. Even though you're at your rested state, and you achieve your most rested state whenever you're in your deepest sleep. Okay. So you only achieve this at night or during the day. Excuse me. Whenever you're in your deepest sleep. Okay. At that point, not all physiological systems cease to exist, but they slow down, or are the only needed metabolic processes that are needed for survival are activated or active during that time. All other systems are either deactivated or suppressed. Okay. So that's whenever you reach your most rested state, and at that point your heart rate is at its slowest that it'll ever be. All right, you can't achieve anything slower than your resting heart rate. Okay, again, it's not 0 heartbeats per minute, because like I said, you'd be dead. So even whenever you hold your breath or you go to sleep, your heart still works in order to keep you alive. Okay. On the other end of the spectrum, you can see here it says 100% intensity. Okay. What's associated with 100% intensity is what's called the VO2 max. Okay, so this right here, VO2 max, is one of our measures of fitness. Okay, to understand how fit you are, one of the ways that we can determine that is by measuring your VO2 max. Okay, so VO2 stands for the volume of oxygen. So O2 stands for oxygen. So it's the volume of oxygen. It's the maximum volume of oxygen that you can consume during activity. Okay, so the higher your VO2 max, the more fit you are. Okay, so just to give you an idea of numbers in the units, it's measured in units called milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Okay, now that's a lot of units for a measurement, so we just leave the units out and we just simply refer to the number. So an average VO2 max will be around 40, about 40 to 45. World-class marathon runners, they're in the 90s. Okay, people who live a sedentary lifestyle, they'd be lucky to achieve a VO2 max of like 10 to 20. Okay, so depending on how fit you are will determine how high your VO2 max is. Okay, so VO2 max is a measure of fitness. The other measure of fitness that I will talk a little bit more about, whenever we continue this discussion, is resting heart rate. That's also a measure of fitness. Excuse me. Now, you can't control what your resting heart rate is, but you can. The more fit you are, the more efficient your cardiovascular system becomes. So therefore, less beats per minute are needed in order for you to survive. Okay? So hold on one second. Okay, so then going back to the right end of the spectrum again, looking at 100% intensity, this is also VO2 max, the maximum volume of oxygen that you can consume per bout of physical activity. The last measure here you see is MHR. That stands for maximum heart rate. At this point, when you reach 100% intensity, you have also reached the maximum your heart can beat. Your heart cannot beat faster than this. Well, not normally. If it was under the influence of like some psychoactive drugs, yeah, sure, it could beat faster than that. But this is whenever you're in a full-fledged, all-out physical bout, whether it's a dead sprint or you're fighting for your life or whatever. Your heart rate will achieve the maximum that can be achieved. All right. We know this number because we can just simply take the number 220 minus your age, and that should give you a pretty accurate measure of what your maximum heart rate is. So if you're 20 years of age, you take the number 220 minus 20, your maximum heart rate is around 200 beats per minute. Okay. Now, it may be 1 or 2 beats more, it may be 1 or 2 beats less, but it's pretty good indicator of what your maximum heart rate can be. Okay, so the older you become, the lower your maximum heart rate becomes. Okay. Okay, so we have two ends of the spectrum. We have 0% intensity. We have 100% intensity, and then you have this point, or this point right, almost right in the middle of the continuum, at 60% intensity. All right, this is known as the lactate or the anaerobic threshold. Okay, at this point, physical activity becomes uncomfortable. It starts to become uncomfortable. All right, now what do I mean by uncomfortable? Well, you've all experienced it whenever you engage in physical activity, whether it's through regular exercise or if you're just late for class and you're running, from your car to class, you experience discomfort. What are some symptoms of discomfort? Well, you start to breathe faster, you start to sweat, you start to, perhaps you start to feel some pain. With the muscles being worked at such a high intensity in a short duration of time. Physiologically, your blood pressure starts to increase, your heart rate increases, your respiration increases. There's lots of things that start to happen whenever you push yourself beyond the lactate threshold. All right, now the reason why it's called the lactate threshold is because you start to produce lactic acid in the muscles, which is the byproduct of physical activity, but it's also your body's natural regulator. In other words, this is your body's way of telling you or regulating how much you actually do. Because if you're doing too much, it's going to produce a lot more lactic acid, and really the lactic acid blocks all metabolic processes. So you can't continue functioning. All right. Now, you want that to happen because if you continued, then you would either burn up and your body temperature would get too high, and you'd start to actually cook yourself inside. So, having lactic acid is a good thing. It's something that we have to understand so that we can continue or we can prolong exercise for health benefits. For those of you who are athletes, you have to understand how to regulate your lactate production so that you can continue with training bouts to enhance athletic performance. But nonetheless, the reason why you start to experience discomfort at a certain intensity level whenever you're engaged in physical activity is because lactic acid is starting to accumulate in the muscles. Now, the more intense your exercise is, then the faster the lactic acid builds up, and the quicker it starts to block metabolic processes, and thus disallows you or prevents you from continuing at that intensity any longer. All right. So again, you've probably experienced this if you've ever gone for a dead sprint. I mean, if you've ever run track, or if you're ever running away from somebody, I mean, you could take off in a dead sprint, but within about 10 to 12 seconds, you'll be like, okay, I can't continue at this rate. I have to slow down and either stop and to catch my breath, or I have to slow down to pace myself so that I can continue moving. Okay. This point in the middle is also known as the anaerobic threshold, because at this point the activity becomes more and more anaerobic. Okay, so the higher intense the activity, whatever you're involved in or you're engaged in, the higher the intensity, the more anaerobic the activity is, and the quicker fatigue starts to set in. Okay. So pretty much whenever we look at this continuum, anything before 60% is what we call 100% aerobic. Okay. Now you might remember this from your high school or college biology classes. Aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. Okay. Those are basic definitions of aerobic and anaerobic. I'm gonna talk to you guys about the actual scientific definition of aerobic, or at least the physiological definition of aerobic and anaerobic in a second. But for now, this is a good time to introduce the bottom portion of this continuum. You can see the differences in color. All right, so from 0 to 60% intensity, or before the lactate or anaerobic threshold, activity at this point is 100% aerobic. Okay, so whenever you get to the lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold, it becomes more and more anaerobic. So in the green level, you can see that you can see down here at the bottom, this is the optimal fat burning zone. So if your goal with physical activity is to burn fat, you would engage in activity that forces your heart rate to stay within this zone for a prolonged period of time on a regular basis. Okay, so just because you go for a run around the lake one time and your heart rate's in this zone, and I'm going to explain heart rate in a second, just bear with me for now. Let's just go over the continuum so you can understand what's going on with the rest of the discussion. So if you maintain your heart rate in this zone for a prolonged period of time, just one time, nothing's going to happen. But whenever you engage in this type of activity that causes you to maintain this heart rate in this zone for a prolonged period of time, on a regular basis, whether it's every day or every other day or most days of the week, then eventually you'll start to notice a difference in your body fat percentage. All right, that's how we burn fat. Okay, the blue zone means that it has become more and more anaerobic and less aerobic. So you can see the difference between the green zone and the blue zone. Green zone, 75% aerobic, 25% anaerobic. The blue zone, it's 50% aerobic, 50% anaerobic. Okay. The pink zone, the intensity is so high that the activity is less aerobic and more anaerobic. Okay. Now the 75 and the 50% and the 20, I mean, those are arbitrary numbers for now, but the shift in the energy output is consistent. Okay, so in other words, you rely less and less on oxygen in order to maintain a high level of or you're less and less able to utilize oxygen to maintain physical activity as the intensity increases. Okay, so again, if you go on a dead sprint and you're in this red zone immediately from the get-go, it's 0% aerobic or very close to being totally anaerobic, which means you can't last more than 8 to 12 seconds. Okay, and that's just the way it is. Okay. Now the benefit of exercising in this zone for regular periods of time is that you develop your strength during that in that zone. Okay. So again, when we talk about fitness, I'm gonna try to help you guys understand what your goals are whenever you engage in physical activity. Okay. Now, physical activity is any movement that you sustain for a prolonged period of time, whether it's walking up the stairs or running from your car to the parking lot. I mean, from the parking lot to the classroom, whether it's doing yard work or housework, or if it's planned physical activity, in the form of exercise. When you plan that you're going to exercise and you're going to do this, this discussion will help you develop your own exercise routine in order to achieve the goals you want to achieve. Okay? All right, so let me go back to this continuum and kind of give you an example of what's going on with all the different levels of intensity and the METs and the heart rates and the lactate and anaerobic thresholds. Okay, so let's start off at 0% intensity. At this point, as I mentioned earlier, this is what your heart rate or the intensity that you're experiencing whenever you're in your deepest sleep. Okay, so you're not doing anything. It doesn't mean that you're dead. It just means you're not doing anything. Your most rested state. Physiologically, your body's only engaged in metabolic processes that will keep you alive. That's it. Okay. If it's digesting something, then there's your body's required to work a little bit more. If it's producing or secreting a gland, a hormone, then it's required to do a little bit more. But let's say for simple purposes that it's just surviving. Okay, so it's 0% intensity, and your heart rate is at its lowest that you could possibly achieve naturally. Okay, all right. So let's say it's the morning time. You wake up. One of the first things you do, you probably go to the restroom. Perhaps you brush your teeth, you wash your hands. You walk to the kitchen to get a drink of water. You go back to your bedroom or to your closet. You pick out your clothes, you iron your clothes, you get in the shower. You start doing your daily activities. Okay, and we all do this. Okay, now since we're moving, the intensity has increased. We're not trying to engage in exercise where we're high intensity exercise or training or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is that we are moving. We are engaged in physical activity. So your heart rate starts to increase. It's no longer at resting. It has started to increase. If your resting heart rate is 40 beats per minute, your heart rate, may be up into the 50s or even into the 60s. But the fact of the matter is that your heart has started to increase. Now, at this time, are you engaged in any physical activity that's discomfort or that's uncomfortable or causing any kind of pain or discomfort? No. I mean, you're engaged in simple activity, and pretty much, since this activity at this point is 100% aerobic, in other words, you haven't really reached this intensity level, you can engage in any of these activities at this intensity level pretty much forever. If you're, just, brushing your teeth and then you're doing your hair, you're, doing your makeup, getting dressed, eating or whatever, walking to the car, I mean, that activity isn't stressful. It isn't, it's not causing any kind of discomfort. So, therefore, you can do that activity forever and ever without even stopping. Now, at some point you probably would stop, but it wouldn't be because of, like a physiological necessity. It would be because probably you're just mentally bored of just doing the same activity for such a long time without fatigue. Okay? So at this point, just engage in normal daily activities and in the duration that you do them, your heart rate does increase, but it stays in this 100% aerobic zone, meaning that it really doesn't cause any stress or challenge or discomfort. Okay? All right. Now, let's say, you do something. Let's say you are late to class, and you've experienced that before where you get out of your car, you look at your watch, and like, oh man, I'm class starts in 2 minutes. I really need to book it. All right. And you take off. Okay? Let's say your heart rate does push beyond the lactate threshold. How do we know that? Well, there's an equation I'm going to show you in a second. But let's say it does push beyond the threshold. Like I said earlier, you'll start to experience discomfort. You'll start to experience signs of stress. Your heart rate is increased. Your breathing rate is increased. You start to sweat because your body temperature has risen. That's your natural body's defense against increased or elevated body temperature. You don't want to cook your insides. Your blood pressure is increased. All of these things that you experience whenever you're stressed is an attempt to send oxygenated blood to the muscles in order for you to keep working. All right? We'll talk about the fight or flight syndrome or response later on this semester. But that's what you're experiencing whenever you engage in physical activity that causes you to feel this stress. Okay. Now, at this point, if it's a one-time thing, then you're not gaining any benefits. You're not going to start losing weight just because you're late to class. You're not going to lose weight because you stuck your finger in an electrical outlet and your heart rate, you jumped and you're like, whoa, your heart rate increased a little bit. That's not how we lose weight. That's not how we enhance performance. How we do that is by engaging activity that causes us to push beyond this lactate threshold for a prolonged period of time on a regular basis. Okay, and that's why we have this fat burning zone. So let's say you just said, you know what, I want to lose weight, then you're going to have to push yourself beyond this threshold for a prolonged period of time on a regular basis, and eventually you'll start to experience results. Okay, and I'm going to give you the equation in a second so that you can understand what your heart rate, what your target heart rate zone should be in order to experience those benefits. Okay. All right, so again, if you're just engaged in normal daily activity, sure, you're moving, you're walking, you're standing, you're climbing stairs or whatever, but at this point, activity is 100% aerobic, meaning that you can meet the demand for oxygen. Your body's demand for oxygen can be met, and you can keep doing activity forever and ever and ever and ever. Okay, but the more intense the activity becomes, then the less capable you are sustaining that activity at higher intensities. Okay? All right, so I wanted you to understand this continuum so that you can, whenever we can continue on our discussion, you can always come back to them and say, oh, okay, now I understand what he means. Now I understand what he means. I know right now it's like a bunch of colors and, it looks pretty, but, for some of you, you're just like, well, what does all this have to do with anything? Well, trust me. Whenever you start designing a workout plan, and I tell you, okay, your target heart rate zone should be between 60 to 70% of your VO2 max, simply because, or 100% of your max heart rate, simply because that's the optimal fat burning zone, or between 70 to 80% because that's the optimal training zone. Okay, so then you'll understand where these numbers are coming from. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. So I told you that I'd give you some definitions, first starting with aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic, that means with oxygen, but what it really means is that oxygen is being used for energy production. And whenever you're engaged in activity that's 100% aerobic, it means that we can continue producing all the energy we need to continue sustaining that activity. Okay, it's totally reliant on, well, I shouldn't say totally reliant. It relies on all three different types of nutrients, the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, but we'll talk about nutrition later on. So at this point, we can produce the oxygen we need to sustain physical activity. The term anaerobic, and you know this from high school and college biology, it refers to without oxygen. And that's true. What it means is that oxygen is not used for energy production. Okay. Now, and why not? It's because we can't meet the demand for oxygen. Okay, the byproduct of anaerobic metabolism is lactic acid. I've talked about that earlier in this discussion. So whenever you engage in activity that's so intense that actually your body can't meet the demand for, or the total demand for oxygen, whatever it's lacking in that demand, or whatever it can't meet the demand, that means it's continuing without oxygen or anaerobically, but the byproduct of that is lactic acid, and that's what causes the fatigue and soreness. Okay, this causes you to slow down. Okay, so the more intense you're engaged in physical activity, the quicker the lactic acid builds up in your muscles, and the quicker fatigue sets in. Okay, now if you're engaged in intensity that's beyond the lactate threshold, but not so high, so between that 60 to 70% zone, you could sustain physical activity, but eventually you'll start to fatigue. Okay, and the reason why is because of the lactic acid. Excuse me. So the question is, what makes exercise anaerobic? The simple answer is the demand for oxygen can't be met. Okay, so as long as if the demand for oxygen can be met, then the activity is aerobic, and if it can't, then it's anaerobic. Simple as that. Okay, and I'll explain the benefits of anaerobic and aerobic activity in a second. Okay. So in terms of physical activity, I mentioned earlier that anytime you move, doing whatever, whether it's brushing your teeth, eating some food, or walking to class, whatever it is, it's movement, it's physical activity. Bottom line. Exercise, however, is planned or structured physical activity in order to achieve and maintain fitness. So whenever we exercise, we actually have a plan in place to achieve a goal that we have in mind. Okay. Now, to be physically fit, it means to be able to perform moderate to vigorous levels of activity without fatigue. Okay. So in other words, you're able to go out for a long jog and push yourself without getting tired immediately. Okay. That's what physical fitness means. So it means that you have the capacity to function. Okay. So going back to the energy continuum. No, let me continue. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so in the energy continuum, you saw the term MET, or the acronym MET, and what that stands for: metabolic equivalence of a task. Okay, so one MET, let's say one MET, in order to keep you alive at rest, is all that's needed to keep you in order to keep you alive. So your basic metabolic rate, or your basal metabolic rate, is your heart rate, your body temperature, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, and your breathing rate. Those are at one MET. At one MET, that's the least that your body requires in order to keep you alive at rest. Okay. Now, whenever we engage in higher activity can then be measured in the form of METs, meaning you take the heart rate that's needed for rest, then you multiply by 2 or 3 or 6 or up to 15 times, depending on how much is needed to sustain activity at that intensity level. Okay, so whenever we group activity, we can group activity into light, moderate, and vigorous activity according to how many METs are required to keep you, or to continue that activity. Okay, so 3 METs isn't a whole lot. 3 to 6 METs is a little bit more, but anything over 6 METs is considered to be vigorous. So that's just a basic, explanation of what METs are. For this class, we don't really look at METs, but you can see some examples here of what light activity is, moderate activity, vigorous activity. What I like to use, and even with VO2 max. VO2 max, I said, is one of the single best measures of fitness, but we don't have the capacity on campus to measure VO2 max. So I don't really like using VO2 max. Now there are, and the reason why is because it requires a maximum test known as the Bruce protocol in order to determine someone's true or accurate VO2 max. The Bruce protocol is, I guess, similar to what a stress test is in a medical setting, but it's not. It's a little more strenuous than that. So a Bruce protocol is someone would get onto a treadmill. They perform a test, and in this test, at every 3 minutes, the speed of the treadmill increases and the incline of the treadmill increases. Okay, so at first, the first 3 minutes is relatively slow. You're starting at rest. Typically, in order to get an accurate measure at baseline, we have the subject just sit for about 15 minutes. Again, they won't ever achieve their resting heart rate because they're not sleeping, but at least it does lower their heart rate to the point where we can say, okay, well, this is the closest that we can get to rest without actually getting to to going to sleep. So we get a baseline measure. Then we put we would put the subject on a treadmill. Now we don't do this at OLU. I've done this in my graduate work when I was at Oklahoma State. So we'd have the subject on a treadmill, and we just have them start walking on a treadmill. All right. So again, this is physical activity. It's aerobic, but their heart rate is increasing. Okay, so they're starting to walk, for 3 minutes, on a treadmill. And after 3 minutes, the speed increases and the incline increases. So now they start to jog uphill. Now they're starting to jog uphill. And if you've ever jogged uphill, you know that it's kind of challenging. It does increase heart rate, so their heart rate does increase. They can start to experience some soreness and some burn. Their body temperature starts to rise. I mean, they're starting to feel stressed. It's still light enough in nature so that they are intensity so they can continue on. But at the same time, they're starting to experience some challenge, a lot more so than whenever they started the test in those first that first 3 minute segment. Okay, now after 3 minutes, the treadmill increases in speed and it increases in incline. So now you start to become, or the subject starts to run really uphill. I mean a steep hill. And within those 3 minutes, usually most people, they fatigue and they can't continue any longer. Okay. Now during the Bruce protocol, and I wish I had some videos to show you. I didn't even think about it. But during the Bruce protocol, the subject is hooked up to an EKG machine, and whenever you start the test, you ask the subject his age or his or her age. And you just take the number 220 minus their age, and already before the test even begins what their maximum heart rate is. So at least you'll know like when they're approaching their maximum heart rate. Okay, so whenever they're hooked up to the EKG monitor, you can see what their heart rate is, and as they're continuing with the test, you can see that their heart rate is approaching closer and closer to their maximum heart rate, to the point where whenever they get close to their maximum heart rate, we usually have 2 people standing behind them just in case they just couldn't hold themselves up anymore and they fell off the treadmill. We'd be able to catch them. Okay. During the Bruce protocol, at the same time, there's like a mouthpiece that's inserted into the subject's mouth, and there's a tube that comes out, and it allows for and the tube is connected to a metabolic cart. And the metabolic cart would capture the gas in the subject's breath. Okay, so obviously you breathe in oxygen, and then you breathe out carbon dioxide. So whenever you're breathing out the same amount of carbon dioxide that you're breathing in. You're getting close to your maximum heart rate or to your VO2 max. You're pretty much consuming, your cells are consuming all the oxygen that it can consume, and that's why it's called the VO2 max, or the maximum volume of oxygen that you can consume. Okay. Now we don't have this capacity though, Lou. We're working on it. We have a couple of professors working on some grants to try to purchase the equipment. It's very expensive. So what we rely on are the Cooper test and the bulky protocol. The Cooper test. Let's see if I can get this going. Maybe this. Okay. No, that video doesn't work. Okay. So here's the Cooper test. The Cooper test, posits that a VO2 max is equal to the distance traveled in 12 minutes, and that distance in meters traveled in 12 minutes minus 505, and then all of that divided by 45. Okay, that's the VO2 max test. Okay, so your assignment for next Tuesday is to complete this equation. I want you to go out for a jog and determine how far do you run in 12 minutes. Okay, now if you measure it in miles, that's fine. I don't know that you measure in meters. Some of you will, so you don't have to do any work. If you measure it in miles or feet or whatever it is that you measure, you're going to have to convert to meters. So whatever that conversion to meters is, you input that distance into the equation, and then you subtract 505. You'll get an answer, and in that number you divide by 45. And that'll give you your VO2 max. Now, this is a sub-maximal test. This isn't a maximal test, so it's not completely accurate. But at least it'll give us an idea of how fit you are. Okay, so that's the assignment for next Tuesday. Okay, so since we can't do an accurate VO2 max test, now the VO2 max test that you're doing with the calculation, it's just an opportunity for you to just to experience or to be able to test on your own. but there is a direct correlation between VO2 max and heart rate. So whenever you approach your VO2 max, you're also approaching your maximum heart rate. So in other words, you can't consume more oxygen. You can't continue on. You've reached your maximum heart rate. You can't continue on. It's a direct relationship. Okay. At rest, your heart rate is at its resting heart rate. It doesn't mean that it's not beating, because like I said earlier, if you're not beating, then you're dead. So you still have a heart rate, and at the same time, you still have to breathe oxygen. You breathe in the least amount of oxygen that you need throughout the day, just like your heart beats the least amount of times that it needs to throughout the day. Okay, so at rest, you have your resting heart rate and your resting metabolic rate, okay, or oxygen consumption. At maximum, you have your VO2 max and your maximum heart rate. So since there's a direct relationship between the two, and it's very easy to determine your heart rate, we use heart rate to determine, or as a measure of fitness. Okay, so in order to determine your target heart rate zone, okay, so first of all, resting heart rate, if you don't remember from me mentioning it earlier, resting heart rate also is a measure of fitness. Okay. Now, if you want to know if you're improving your fitness levels, then measure your heart rate, or your resting heart rate now, and do so maybe 2 or 3 times to get an average, and then do it again, 6 weeks after you started an exercise routine, and I guarantee you, resting heart rate will decrease. Okay, it just means that your heart becomes more and more efficient at pumping the blood that your body needs. Okay. So maximum heart rate, in order to determine maximum heart rate, take the number 220 minus your age. So if you're 20 years of age and your maximum heart rate is 220 minus 20, that's 200 beats per minute. Okay. Now, in order to determine your target heart rate zone, there's an equation that you have to input all this information into. This is called the Carvonin formula, the Carvonin method. Okay, and you can see that the first step is taking your maximum heart rate, 220 minus your age, and then you have to subtract your resting heart rate. Now, how do you check your resting heart rate when you're at your deepest sleep? Well, if you have somebody that can, then great. If not, then just simply check your heart rate before you start moving. Remember, whenever you start moving, your heart rate starts to increase. So, moving is getting up to go to the restroom or brushing your teeth. I mean, whenever you wake up and you're still laying in bed, check your heart rate. Do it a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and get an average, and that'll help us determine what your resting heart rate is right now. Okay. So whenever you take the number 220 minus your age, that's your maximum heart rate, and you subtract that from your resting heart rate. So you're pretty much getting your maximum heart rate versus the minimal heart rate that you can achieve. That is your heart rate reserve. Okay? The heart rate reserve is an indicator of how much you can work. Okay? The greater this number, the more you can do. So on the flip end, the lower this number, the lesser this number, the less work you're capable of doing. Okay, so if you think about it, if you have 2 individuals who are both 20 years of age, so their maximum heart rate, both individuals, 220 minus their age is 200 beats a minute. So both of their maximum heart rates are the same. But let's say you have one individual who's extremely fit. Their resting heart rate may be 40 beats per minute, whereas the other individual is extremely sedentary and perhaps even obese, almost like world's largest man status. Okay. This is an extreme comparison. Okay, both of them the same age, both of them have the same maximum heart rate. The fit individual, their resting heart rate is 40 beats per minute. Doesn't require a lot of work to keep them alive. The unfit individual, their resting heart rate may be 100 beats per minute. All right, so you look at the person with that has the lesser of the 2 resting heart rates. 220 or 200 beats per minute minus 40, that's 160 beats per minute. Whereas the unfit individual, their resting heart rate's 100 beats per minute. That's 200 minus 100. That's 100 beats. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, the fit individual has 160 beat range in order to do work. So it takes a lot longer for that person to reach their maximum heart rate. Whereas the unfit individual, their range is only 100 beats per minute. So, you know, reaching their maximum heart rate is a lot quicker. So they're not able to sustain physical activity for prolonged or as prolonged a period of time as the fit individual. Okay, that's what the heart rate reserve means. So, you know, whenever you start exercising, your goal is to increase your heart rate reserve. How do you do that? You can't change your maximum heart rate, but you can change your resting heart rate. So again, the more fit you are, the lower your resting heart rate becomes, simply because it requires less and less work to maintain, to maintain survival. Okay. Now, for exercise purposes, you use a percentage of your heart rate reserve in order to determine the level of exercise intensity. Okay, and again, we use the Carvonen formula. All right, so here are the steps. You take the number 220 minus your age, and you get maximum heart rate. For this example, I used a 27-year-old. So 220 minus 27 is 193. Okay. Now, from 193, that's maximum heart rate, I subtracted resting heart rate. For this example, I inserted the number 70, just because that's the average resting heart rate for Americans. You have to be able to determine your own resting heart rate. Okay, if your resting heart rate is 40, then you would input right here 40 in this slot right here. If it's 35, then put 35. If it's 135, then put 135 right here. Okay. So then you get your heart rate reserve simply by taking the number 193, which is from this example, that's the maximum heart rate. So 193 minus the resting heart rate is the heart rate reserve. This is the functional capacity. For this person, 27 years of age with a 70 beats per minute resting heart rate, their heart rate reserve is 123 beats per minute. Okay, so this is where it gets tricky. All right, in order to determine the heart rate for the desired training zone. Okay, so going back to the continuum at the beginning of the discussion, the desired training zone should be either 60 to 70%, that's the optimal fat burning zone, or for those of you who are training perhaps for competition or trying to enhance your performance, then your target training zone should be between 70 to 80%. Okay? So you have to push yourself. I used to work as a personal trainer, and I used to have clients who come, and I've exercised for 6 months, 45 minutes a day. I haven't lost a pound. And I asked them, what do they do? And they just go out for walks, around the neighborhood, which is great, but they weren't walking very fast. So they could walk at that pace, they could have walked forever. They weren't ever pushing themselves. Okay? So, I showed them this formula, and I said, okay, hey, you need to push yourself to the point where you're reaching at least 60% of your heart rate reserve, of your functional capacity, and then they started to experience some differences or some changes in the few weeks after that. Okay, so for this example, we're going to use 60% of the target rate. That's in the energy continuum. That's the lactate threshold. So I'm just going to simply put 60%. Now, whenever you're using this in the equation, you can't type in 60%. You have to type in 0.60 because that's the proportion of 1. Okay, so 120, and then you multiply 0.60, and you get this number 73.8. This number really doesn't mean anything because you have to add back the resting heart rate. Okay, so whenever you add this number to the resting heart rate, you get 143.8 beats per minute. That's the lower target, or the lower anchor of that target training zone, of that 60 to 70% training zone. Okay, so if you want to push your lactate threshold, if you're 27 years of age with a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute, and you want to push your 60% or your lactate threshold, you should be exercising at about 144 beats per minute. Okay, at least 144 beats per minute. Now, in order to determine the upper anchor of that range, you would redo the formula, but instead of multiplying 123 by 0.60, you would multiply 123 times 0.70. Okay, and in this case, the number would be like 83 or 84. Okay, and then you still have to add back the 70, and whatever this was 84 plus 70, that's about 154 beats. Okay, so in order for a 27-year-old with a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute, they would have to exercise between 144 and 154 beats per minute for about 20 to 30 minutes, at least 4 times a week. That's in order to achieve fat burning. Okay, the longer you sustain that activity, or the more times per week that you engage in that activity, the quicker the results start to achieve. Okay, so it's anywhere between 6 weeks to 6 months, just depending on how intense you are, how committed you are to losing weight. Okay, if you're wanting to compete or get stronger or get better, then you just simply use the higher numbers in order to determine your heart rate during the time we're engaged in activity. Okay. All right. So I hope that you understand this formula. This is a very effective formula, especially if you're trying to design, an exercise plan that's going to help you achieve results. Okay. But again, you have to. Well, obviously, you know your age, but you have to be able to measure your resting heart rate, even if you have to do it yourself. Just do it before you get out of bed every morning, and get an average, and you'll be able to determine your resting heart rate. And then you'll also see that your resting heart rate will decrease with an exercise or executing an exercise plan over the course of several weeks to a couple of months. Okay. Real quick, let me pause. Okay, so at this point, hopefully you start to understand, how to develop an exercise plan. Okay, now the type of activity you do doesn't matter. You could run for 20 to 30 minutes. You can swim for 20 to 30 minutes. You can engage in a group fitness class for 20 to 30 minutes. You can do insanity for 20 to 30 minutes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Your body doesn't know what it's doing whenever you're engaged in different types of activity. All that matters is that your body is working. That's all it cares about. Your heart, all it knows is that it needs to work. It needs to go. Okay? So your body doesn't know that you're dancing one day and the next day you're doing, group fitness, or the next day you're doing, you're jogging. So if you want to change it up, go ahead. Go ahead. As long as you're consistent with your target heart rate zone. Now, give yourself a chance. Go out for a run and measure your heart rate. And I'm going to show you in a second how to measure your heart rate. Go out for a run, measure your heart rate, and then the next day, instead of going out for a run, just stand in your living room and dance for 20 minutes. I guarantee your heart rate will increase. Your body doesn't know the difference. All it knows is it needs to work. Okay. The key is to move, and to move on a regular basis, and to move with a goal in mind. And this is going to help you design your plan, because this is going to say, okay, this is where my heart rate in particular, this is an individual concept. My target heart rate at 60% is going to be different from yours, and it's going to be different from everyone's. Okay? You have to understand your own body and how it works in order to determine your own resting heart rate. Okay? Now, how do you know what your heart rate is? Okay? Well, there's different ways that you can check your own body. You can check the radial pulse. Let me see if I can get it into the camera. There we go. That was smart. I moved the camera. All right. So the easiest way that I know to check your heart rate without any electronic devices is to check your radial pulse. Now, your radial pulse, you can find it if you find the bump that's on the same side on your wrist. That's on the same side as your thumb. I'm trying to get it into the camera. So here's your thumb. There's a bump right here. Okay? If you put your finger on both sides of that bump, and don't push hard, just push gently, you can feel the pulse. Okay? Now you can count how many beats that you feel in a 15-second segment, and then simply multiply by 4, because there's 4 15-second segments in a minute. You can count for 60 seconds. You can count how many beats are in an entire minute. You can count how many beats there are in 10 seconds, but then you'd multiply by 6, because there's 6 10-second segments in a minute. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're able to determine how many beats are in a 10 to 15 second segment. Whatever you choose, just multiply it by the necessary number of segments that equal 1 minute. Okay, that's checking a pulse. Now, whenever you're out for a jog and you're engaged in higher intense activity, sometimes it becomes difficult to measure your heart rate manually. So I always suggest to use a heart rate monitor, preferably one with the strap and a wristwatch. Okay, the wristwatch contains a sensor a remote that is connected wirelessly to the sensor that's located on the chest plate. Okay, so as the heart beats, the sensor captures it and it sends the signal to the watch, and you can see this 158 right here. That's how many beats per minute. So you can just look at your watch and you can see what your heart rate is. Okay, so you don't have to check your pulse or your neck, your carotid pulse. You can just look at your watch and say, okay, I know my heart rate. Now, this isn't a requirement. This is just suggestion. But if you do choose that you want to purchase a heart rate monitor, just get one of the cheaper ones. I find them on eBay. Some of them are used. If you want a brand new one, that's fine. But I wouldn't spend a lot of money on them. We have some in our lab. So yeah, look to spend anywhere between $30 and $40, and you can get a pretty decent heart rate monitor. Okay, and that's really the easiest way to check your heart rate. Okay, all right. So now that we know how to check heart rate, how to plan out an exercise plan, by selecting a target training zone, what starts to happen? How do you start losing weight? We know that people who engage in exercise on a regular basis, they have lower body masses because they have lower body fat percentages. Why is that? How does that happen? Okay, so in order to understand that, we're going to first look at the body's sources of fuel, so that you start to understand how the body uses the nutrients that are located in the body, and then you'll be able to determine or understand how the body uses those fuels in order to produce energy and lose weight. Okay, so there are 4 different types of fuel sources. 3 of them are probably pretty familiar to you, or you're probably pretty familiar with. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. All right, those are 3 of our nutrients. There's six nutrients. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and then you have water, vitamins, and minerals. Water, vitamins, and minerals don't provide us with energy in the form of calories. Fats, proteins, and carbohydrates do. The other fuel source that's on this page, and this might be surprising to you, is lactic acid. Okay, so when lactic acid accumulates in the body, we don't consume lactic acid. We produce it. So whenever it's present in the body will actually use that first before it uses carbohydrates. You can see that carbohydrates are the most preferred fuel source because it's so easily converted to energy. However, if lactic acid is accumulated in the muscles or is present in the muscles, then it uses lactic acid to produce energy before it uses carbohydrates. Okay. The last 2, fats and proteins. Fats are highly efficient at producing energy, but it's a little more difficult to convert to energy than carbs, so it's not as preferred as carbohydrates. And proteins are the last resort. This is we don't store proteins. If we need protein in order to build or to repair our body, obviously, we use protein to build our muscles if we're into muscular fitness. But if we don't use it, if it's not used for building or for repair, we just get rid of it. We don't store it. Okay. So in order for the body to use protein, it has to eat itself. It has to break down its own muscles and its own bones, its own skin. Anywhere there's protein, it has to break it down in order to convert to energy. So it's very difficult, but really it's the last resort. Okay, this chart here shows different metabolic processes with the breakdown of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. You don't need to know any of it, really. All I want you to see is that no matter what you're consuming, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, or if there's lactic acid that's built up inside the muscles that's a byproduct of anaerobic activity, either way, they all end up in the same system known as the electron transport system. Okay, so fats are either eventually broken down into the molecules needed to go into the electron transport system. Same with the carbohydrates, same with proteins, same with lactic acid. All of it ends up in the electron transport system. Where is that electron transport system located? Well, if you guys know this, you guys know that this is a cell. This is just a typical diagram of one of the body's cells. Okay, so you have the nucleus, you have the endoplasmic reticulum, you have Golgi apparatus, and then you have these little components, these organelles known as mitochondria. All right, so you probably studied mitochondria in high school biology, perhaps even in college biology. You know that these are the powerhouses of the cell. And the reason why they're called the powerhouses of the cell is because this is where energy is produced. Okay, so energy has to enter. The organic molecule, which is either carbohydrate, fat, protein, or the lactic acid, will enter the mitochondria along with oxygen, and out comes carbon dioxide. This is the carbon dioxide we breathe out. So all the carbon dioxide we breathe out actually is developed or produced in each of the mitochondria in every cell in the body. There's like 75 trillion cells in the body. Okay, so that's where, so the carbon dioxide eventually enters the bloodstream and eventually exits the body via the lungs. Okay, the other byproduct of metabolic metabolism is this molecule here known as ATP. That stands for adenosine triphosphate. For this class, you don't need to know that. All you need to know is that this is a unit of energy. Okay, this is the energy we need in order to survive. Okay, so everything we do, whether we move, when we move, muscles need energy in order to move. When we, whenever we, digest food, the muscles in the digestive system need energy in order to maintain function. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, our carbohydrates are the most preferred fuel source. Okay, so if carbohydrates are readily available, they'll simply use carbohydrates. However, there's a point where the body realizes detects that the carbohydrate reserve is reaching a critical level. Okay, there's three systems in the body: the brain, the nervous system, and red blood cells that rely solely on carbohydrates. It can't function with fats or proteins. It can only function with carbohydrates. Okay, so the body senses it and it realizes, you know what, we need to keep the remaining glucose supply for these three systems. We need to switch to another fuel source. Okay, this is known as this is the carbohydrate sparing effect. Okay, so carbohydrates are the most preferred fuel source, but whenever the supply is diminished to a critical point, the body senses that it needs to maintain its current carbohydrate supply for these three systems: the brain, the nervous system, and red blood cells, and then it switches to the next preferred fuel source. In this case, it's fat. Okay, this is known as the carbohydrate sparing effect. All right, this is the body's natural switch from carbohydrate utilization to fat utilization as a result of a diminished supply of carbohydrates in the body due to exertion. Okay, so at this point, we start to burn fat. Okay, in trained individuals, this happens very quickly. All right, if you're a trained individual, meaning that you're engaged in physical activity on a regular basis, your body starts to realize, you know what, let's just go ahead and switch to fats now, because we know that we're eventually going to have to do so. Okay, and that's why fed individuals have less fat on themselves. Okay, untrained individuals, it usually takes longer just because your body's not used to it. It hasn't adapted yet. It hasn't made the necessary cellular adaptations in order to become more efficient at burning fat. Okay, so what actually happens inside the cell? So you can see here, I've given you a side-by-side comparison of a cell from an untrained person and a cell from a trained person. Now, again, this is just a general diagram of the cell. I don't think any cell in the body actually looks like this. We have different types of cells. We have muscle cells, bone cells, nerve cells, different types of cells. Okay, but what I want you to see is that the person that's untrained, they have a minimal number of mitochondria in the cell. Again, this is the mitochondria is needed for survival. It realizes that it doesn't need any more because the body wants to be at its most relaxed state. It doesn't want to carry on more weight or more cells or more mitochondria or more bone density than it really needs to. That's why individuals who are engaged in exercise on a frequent basis, their bone density is a lot higher than someone who's not. It's because the body senses that or realizes that it needs to maintain its current bone structure. Okay, so for a person that's untrained, who's sedentary, doesn't exercise on a regular basis, then their body's like, let's get rid of all the unnecessary mitochondria and only keep those that are needed for survival. Okay, so that's why this side of the slide appears to have very little mitochondria. The cell on the right side, on the other hand, is a cell of a trained person. You can see, this is my graphic representation, but you can see how there's a lot more mitochondria in that cell. This person is more efficient at burning off energy or burning off fuel. Okay, so this is what happens with training. All right. Your goal, from a general perspective, is to lose weight. But what actually happens at the cellular level in order for you to lose weight? Well, there's an increase in the number and size of mitochondria, and as a result, more energy is produced for us to use, so we can maintain activity. We have the quicker onset of fat metabolism because your body is so efficient at burning fuel that it burns through carbohydrates really quickly, and it's forced to switch to fat metabolism a lot more quicker than those who are untrained. So, even whenever you take two people who are eating a cheeseburger, the same amount of fat content, same amount of calories, same amount of carbohydrates, same amount of everything, this person, it takes a long time for them to digest that cheeseburger. This person right here, they're burning off that cheeseburger immediately after they eat it because they're so trained. Their body is so proficient so efficient at burning fuel that cheeseburgers don't mean anything to this person. Okay. Now, that's not to say that I want you to go eat cheeseburgers all day, every day, but I hope you get you understand the difference. It's still important to eat a healthy diet. So people who are trained, and again, someone who's engaged in physical activity for a prolonged period of time on a regular basis, eventually they become more efficient at performing that activity. They become better. They have improved ability, and they have improved health related and skill related effects. Okay, and here are the health benefits of aerobic exercise. And so engaging in regular activity for a prolonged period of time, a good 20 to 45 minutes, at least that's what the ACSM or the American College of Sports Medicine recommends, is that we engage in 20 to 45 minutes of regular physical activity at 60 to 80% intensity most days per week. So what is most days per week? Well, at least 4 days, right? 5 days even better. 6 days even better, 7 days even better. I guess it's good to give yourself time to rest, so you don't have to work out every day, but at least most days a week. So at least 4 days a week, 20 to 45 minutes. The more you do, the higher intensity, the more more days per week. Obviously, the quicker the results will set in. But as long as you're committed to a workout plan, eventually your body will start to adapt at the cellular level. Okay. Now it's important to understand that because you can change your diet for a couple of weeks, but your body and you'll lose weight, but your body doesn't make those cellular adaptations. In order to experience results, the sustainable results that you'll experience for the prolonged period of time, you have to force your cells to adapt. Okay. And we do that by engaging activity that pushes beyond the lactate threshold on a regular basis. Okay, so the result of improved fitness, meaning you have more mitochondria in the body, is that you'll have more or improved heart function and efficiency. So your resting heart rate will decrease. Your aerobic work capacity increases, which leads to an increase in VO2 max. So when you look at your fitness right now, and then you compare it to 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now, your resting heart rate will be lower and your VO2 max will be higher. Okay, so next Tuesday, whenever you submit your VO2 max, you look at it again, in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, and then recalculate, and I guarantee your VO2 max will increase. Okay, you'll have an increase in capillary density. This is so obviously we have a cardiovascular system that sends blood throughout the body. Well, with increased physical activity and fitness, your body realizes that it needs more highways to the muscles. So it develops a new capillary system that allows more oxygen, more blood to be sent to the muscles. I mean, if you think about it, it's like you have like Interstate 10 going through the city, and if everybody in the city went on I-10, it'd be very like slow traffic, right? Well, then you start creating these new highways. You got 410, you got 1604, you got 281, you got 151, you got all the side roads, and you allow people to get off and go into the neighborhoods. Then it alleviates traffic. It actually forces traffic into the city, into the neighborhoods, into the community. Well, that's what's happening with capillary density. The more for demand for oxygen, the cardiovascular system starts to develop new networks so that the oxygen and blood can flow into the neighborhood of the muscle. Okay. We do have an increase in total blood volume, so people who are fit have more blood, and that's one of the reasons why the heart becomes more efficient, is because every time it pumps more blood than someone who's unfit. Okay, and then we utilize fat a lot quicker. We have an improved efficiency of utilizing fat. So again, people who are fit, they're burning fat like crazy. Especially if they engage in strength training activity, which we'll talk about next chapter, or later on in this chapter, actually, or maybe chapter 4. I can't remember, but we'll talk about it. Okay, we have lower blood cholesterol, lower body fat percentage, lower prevalence of obesity among people who engage in exercise on a regular basis. Lower resting blood pressure, which is another decrease in prevalence of a disease, and hypertension. Less stress and anxiety. We'll talk more about that when we talk about stress management later on this semester. And a decreased likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease, cancers, and diabetes. So the more you exercise, the more you're committed to becoming an exerciser. Now, a lifelong exerciser, not just an exerciser for the rest of this class. The more you're committed to becoming a lifelong exerciser, then less likely you are to experience any adverse health conditions for the rest of your life. Okay? All right. Well, that completes my my discussion. The remaining slides, you can look at some of the other criteria that the book uses to give as guidelines, but I've already covered most of this. So, if you go through this, you're not going to see anything different from what I've explained to you. Now, the FIT principle, we'll talk more about. I can introduce the FIT principle. The FIT principle it's a good strategy to use whenever you're designing your workout plan. FIT is an acronym. It stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type. It's just a way for you to determine, how much you should do of which. And you can see here's cardiorespiratory endurance, muscular fitness, flexibility. You can see the frequency, how often you should do it. The intensity, how intense the exercise should be, the time or the duration at which this should occur, and then the type. So with aerobic activity, it could be anything from running to swimming to aerobic dance to group fitness classes. I mean, whatever. Muscular fitness depends on the muscle, the muscles you're trying to target. And the same thing with flexibility. It just depends on what which muscles you're trying to increase flexibility on. But we'll talk more about the fit principle a little bit later. Okay, you can go through these terms if you want. Again, I've explained all this information in my terms. You read through this and you'll say, "Oh yeah, that's what Dr. Guerrero meant." Some of it's not, I haven't really mentioned it, but you can go through that. And if you have any questions, just email me and I'll explain what's going on in these slides. Okay, well, or you know what, maybe I might do another lecture later on explaining some of these concepts later on this week. I'll just look at the schedule and see where we are. But for now, I'd like to finish. We're at about an hour and 10 minutes, and I'm kind of getting tired, so I'm going to go ahead and end it. And if you have any questions, let me know. Talk to you soon.